In 1939, Britain commanded history's greatest empire, controlling a quarter of Earth's land and population, with the pound as the world's reserve currency and the Royal Navy ruling the seas. Just 17 years later, by 1956, Britain was pleading with America for permission to defend its own interests. By 1967, the pound had crashed. By 1976, Britain was begging the IMF for a bailout, utterly humbled. The empire that dominated the globe for 2 centuries became a second-tier European nation in merely 3 decades. History textbooks claim Britain's empire fell due to independence movements and the demise of colonialism. And while partially accurate, that's not the complete truth. Britain lost its empire because it went financially bankrupt. Britain won World War II militarily, but lost it economically. Let me show you precisely how Britain bankrupted itself, how America replaced Britain as the dominant superpower, and why Britain's downfall is crucial for understanding America's current trajectory. Britain's empire didn't end voluntarily. It ended because the treasury was empty. Following World War I, the British Empire reached its zenith. By 1920, it spanned 13.7 million square miles, nearly a quarter of Earth's landmass, governing 458 million people, roughly 1/5 of humanity. With possessions on every continent, it genuinely was the empire where the sun never set. However, territory wasn't Britain's true strength, financial power was. The pound sterling served as the global reserve currency. International commerce was transacted in pounds. Nations held pounds in their reserves. London's financial district was the undisputed world banking center. Britain was the planet's largest creditor nation, with British banks financing worldwide projects and British investors owning Argentine railways, South African mines, Indian plantations, and industries across 6 continents. This financial supremacy meant Britain borrowed at the world's lowest interest rates, enabling it to fund its enormous military affordably and finance colonial administration through debt. It controlled international trade by controlling currency and credit. The system rested on the gold standard, with the pound backed by physical gold at a fixed rate. This wasn't merely theoretical. You could actually walk into a bank and exchange paper pounds for real gold, making the currency trustworthy and establishing it as the world's reserve. Britain's economy was the absolute largest. America had already overtaken it, but for an island of just 44 million people, its economic output was massive, second only to the United States. British coal, steel, textiles, and machinery powered global industry. Supporting everything was the Royal Navy, still the planet's largest and most formidable fleet. In 1920, Britain appeared invincible, yet financial fractures were emerging. The first devastating blow was World War I. Between 1914 and 1918, the war cost Britain approximately £35 billion, a figure that might seem modest today, but was catastrophic relative to Britain's economy then. Britain's entire 1914 GDP was roughly £2.5 billion, meaning the war cost 14 times Britain's annual economic output. Where did this money originate? First, taxation. Britain dramatically raised taxes, with income tax skyrocketing from practically nothing to as high as 30%. But even these crushing taxes couldn't cover the immense costs. Second, borrowing. Britain borrowed heavily domestically through war bonds, but crucially also borrowed massive amounts from the United States. For the first time, Britain became a net debtor to America. By 1918, Britain's national debt had exploded from £650 million to over £7.4 billion, an 11-fold increase in just 4 years. Third, asset sales. To pay for weapons and supplies, Britain liquidated its foreign investments. Before the war, it owned vast overseas assets. Afterward, a huge portion of that wealth had been sold off. There was also a currency crisis. In 1914, Britain abandoned the gold standard to print money for war funding. The pound, as good as gold for centuries, suddenly became just paper. They attempted returning to the gold standard in 1925 at the old pre-war rate, which was a catastrophic mistake. The pound was now massively overvalued, rendering British exports expensive and uncompetitive. This decision strangled the British economy, causing deflation and high unemployment throughout the 1920s. The damage was done, but concealed. Britain had transformed from the world's largest creditor to a major debtor, while the United States shifted from debtor to creditor. The global financial power balance had fundamentally changed. though most people didn't recognize it yet. Superficially, Britain appeared to still rule the world, but financially, it was barely surviving. If World War I was expensive, World War II delivered the final devastating blow. The Second War cost Britain another £28 billion, but again, the absolute figure doesn't capture the reality. Relative to its devastated economy, this was an impossible burden. Britain fought World War II through total mobilization. At the war's peak, an astonishing 55% of the entire nation's GDP was dedicated to military spending. Essentially, the whole economy was devoted to the war effort, with food, fuel, and clothing strictly rationed. Every resource was directed toward one objective: survival. This was completely unsustainable. Britain was burning through its remaining wealth, liquidating assets, and borrowing at a rate that would bankrupt any nation. By 1941, Britain was nearing collapse. That's when America intervened with the Lend-Lease program, lending Britain weapons, food, and supplies for repayment after the war. But this wasn't charity. The U.S. charged interest, and in exchange for this lifeline, Britain had to accept American terms, including dismantling trade preferences within the British Empire, opening the empire to American trade and investment, and accepting American financial oversight. Essentially, Britain was trading its empire for survival, while the United States was purchasing global dominance at a bargain. The result was a debt explosion. By 1945, Britain's national debt reached 250% of its GDP. Let me emphasize that the debt was 2.5 times larger than the entire British economy. For comparison, U.S. debt today stands around 123% of GDP, while Greece at its worst debt crisis peaked at 180%. Britain in 1945 was in an entirely different category. It was catastrophic. To service this debt, Britain had to sell everything valuable. Foreign investments were liquidated, gold reserves depleted, overseas holdings, art, buildings, anything of value was sold. By 1945, Britain had completed its transformation from the world's largest creditor nation to the world's largest debtor nation in just 30 years and 2 world wars. Britain was now completely dependent on America, owing the United States over $4.3 billion from 1945, a sum that sounds small, but was a crushing burden on its shattered economy. Britain depended on American loans just to survive and feed its people. While the war still raged, the U.S. and Britain met at Bretton Woods to design the post-war financial system. Britain, represented by the brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes, proposed a new neutral international currency, but the U.S., represented by Harry Dexter White, had a different vision. They wanted the dollar as the new reserve currency backed by gold at $35 an ounce. Britain, bankrupt from 2 world wars, was powerless to object. The U.S. held all the leverage, and so the dollar replaced the British pound. This wasn't merely a technical adjustment. It was the single most significant power transfer of the 20th century. What does being the reserve currency mean? It means everyone needs your money to trade, creating constant global demand for your currency. It means you can run enormous trade deficits indefinitely because the world needs your dollars. You can borrow at the lowest rates, and your financial sector dominates globally. For 2 centuries, Britain enjoyed these incredible advantages. Overnight, they were transferred to the United States. Immediately, the crisis for the British pound began. Britain attempted maintaining the pound's value after the war, but the fundamentals were broken. Their national debt was 250% of GDP, their economy was shattered, they were running massive trade deficits, and the dollar was now king. The pound was grossly overvalued, and everyone knew it. But admitting this meant admitting Britain was no longer a great power. The first humiliation arrived in 1949 when Britain was forced to devalue the pound by 30%, from $4.03 down to $2.80. Great powers don't devalue their currencies, but even this didn't solve the fundamental problem. Britain simply could no longer afford its empire. Consider the costs. Maintaining an empire meant military garrisons globally, naval presence in every ocean, vast colonial administrations, infrastructure investments, and constantly fighting independence movements. Britain's economy was half America's size, yet it was attempting to maintain a global footprint the mathematics just didn't support. The breaking point, the moment the world witnessed the emperor had no clothes, was the 1956 Suez Crisis. Egypt's leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital shipping artery, especially for Middle Eastern oil. Britain, which owned 44% of the canal company, wouldn't accept this. Along with France and Israel, they launched a military operation to retake the canal. Militarily, it succeeded. Within days, British and French forces occupied the canal zone. Then the United States intervened. President Eisenhower was furious, opposing the operation and threatening to bring Britain to its knees not with bombs, but with finance. The U.S. threatened economic sanctions, cutting off oil supplies, and most critically, selling its vast holdings of British pounds, which would have crashed the currency. America also blocked the emergency loans Britain desperately needed from the International Monetary Fund. It was financial blackmail. Britain's foreign reserves were draining, the pound was collapsing. The U.S. delivered a clear ultimatum: withdraw from Suez or face total financial ruin. Britain had no choice. Despite their military victory, they withdrew in complete humiliation. The Suez Crisis revealed the new world order. British military power meant nothing without American financial approval. The empire was a facade, and the U.S. was now controlling everything. Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned in disgrace. The pound came under renewed attack, and across the empire, independence movements recognized Britain's weakness, accelerating their freedom campaigns. Suez didn't cause the empire's end, but made its conclusion undeniable and irreversible. The decline continued. In 1967, Britain devalued the pound again, another 14% cut. Prime Minister Harold Wilson went on television and famously told the British people that the pound in their pocket hadn't been devalued. It was a lie, a desperate one. This was the second major devaluation in less than 20 years. Why did this keep happening? Britain was trapped in a cycle of consuming more than it produced, running trade deficit after trade deficit. When you have the reserve currency, you can sustain this, but Britain didn't anymore. It had to pay for imports with foreign currency and was constantly running out. The Bank of England would try defending the pound by selling reserves and raising interest rates sharply, but it was a losing battle. Devaluation was always inevitable. Through the 1960s and 70s, Britain became known as the sick man of Europe, crippled by stagflation. High inflation combined with economic stagnation. Strikes paralyzed industry. The energy crisis worsened everything. Manufacturing collapsed, and a brain drain saw Britain's best talent leaving for America. The nation that had been Earth's wealthiest just 50 years earlier was now in managed decline. The ultimate humiliation came in 1976 when, facing another currency collapse, Britain had to go cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund, an organization it had helped create, and beg for a bailout. The IMF agreed, but with harsh conditions: cut government spending, raise interest rates, implement austerity. The nation that once ruled a quarter of the world was now taking orders from international bureaucrats. During this period, Britain rapidly liquidated its empire. India and Pakistan in 1947, Malaysia in 1957, most African colonies in the 1960s, until the last major possession, Hong Kong, was handed over in 1997. The official narrative was one of moral enlightenment, gracefully granting independence. The reality was that Britain was bankrupt. Every colony was a drain on the treasury, and the empire had to go because the bills could no longer be paid. So what's the lesson here? Britain's collapse followed a clear pattern. First, massive debt from wars. Second, loss of reserve currency status. Third, persistent deficits from consuming more than producing. Fourth, repeated currency devaluations. Fifth, becoming dependent on foreign creditors. And finally, loss of political independence and forced liquidation of assets. Now look at the United States today. Debt accumulation? We're at $35 trillion and counting from endless wars and spending. Decline in the dollar's reserve status? It's gradual but happening. Persistent trade deficits? Absolutely. Currency pressure? The dollar has lost over 86% of its purchasing power since 1971. Rising debt costs? Interest payments on the national debt now exceed the entire defense budget. Growing constraints on our actions? Without question. The final stage for Britain was empire liquidation. The terrifying question for America is, what do we liquidate? The critical difference is speed. It took Britain roughly 30 years to go from the dominant global empire to an IMF bailout case. In today's hyper-fast, interconnected financial world, What took Britain 3 decades could take America half that time if the trajectory continues. The warning from history is stark. Britain didn't choose to end its empire. It was forced to by financial reality. Empires don't end because of moral progress. They end because they go broke. Financial power is the only real power. Military strength is meaningless if you can't afford to sustain it. And having the world's reserve currency is the ultimate superpower. Britain learned this the hard way. America may be next. If this changed how you see history, make sure to subscribe. I cover the economic forces that truly shape our world. Let me know in the comments. How long do you think it will be before the US faces its own Suez moment? Thanks for watching.